Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. At The Reason We Learn, we aspire to be part of the solution. The purpose of this show is to take a good, honest, potentially painful look at the way kids are being educated. We know we can do better, and this is where we'll talk about how. Let's learn something. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. If you are new to this channel and interested in being part of the solution to our education crisis, I hope you will subscribe to be notified if you're not already. When I make new content, the subscription to the channel does help get these shows out to more people. Please also like and share this particular broadcast so others can benefit from the information we're about to share. As I've said many times, each of these shows is an opportunity to hear from people who are working to improve education and defend individual liberty and reason and reality and all the things that we prize any way they can. And this show is no exception. Noel Kavanagh is a former criminal barrister, now legal commentator. He is one of 3 directors of the Gay Men's Network, a non-for-profit organization fighting modern forms of homophobia. And I have asked him here to talk to us about the WPATH files and the recent decision on the part of his country, England, and also Wales, to ban puberty blockers for minors, which is a big development. But because of his legal background and involvement in these issues, I want him to talk to us about the legal implications of the WPATH files and the decision to ban the puberty blockers, and some surprising things you may not realize about the United States and American, I hesitate to use this word, but here it goes, leadership in the realm of propagating the type of mindset, movement, et cetera, that is represented in the WPATH files. If you're not familiar with the WPATH files, what they are is an expose, basically, of leaked files from the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, otherwise known as WPATH. And we are going to talk a little bit about some of those findings, but I will drop the links for resources underneath after the show, and you can go peruse it at your leisure as much as you can stomach. We'll talk a little bit about it, but we're going to talk more in depth about what it means for us moving forward. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dennis to the broadcast. Hello.
Hello, Deb. Thank you for having me. Hope you're well.
Thank you for coming to help us make sense of all this.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, well, that's all we can ever do. But as I mentioned to the audience, you are a barrister, and you have a better understanding of some of the legal implications. And I know that just this week, thank God, your country has decided to stop prescribing puberty blockers to minors. So perhaps you can maybe start there and help us understand what has been decided and potentially why, and we can move on from there.
Yeah, well, it's a seismic and great week, really. All these things we've been raising for years and years and years, we all feel kind of vindicated. And what's happened is this: the story starts with the former health secretary, a guy called Sajid Javid, ordering an inquiry into the Tavistock under Hilary Cass. As a result of that, she produced an interim report, and in her interim report, Hilary Cass is a former president of the Royal College of Pediatricians, autism specialist, helpfully, in this area. She started making remarks that she was concerned as to the low evidence base for the safety of puberty blockers and the efficacy of puberty blockers, which is lawyer and doctor speak for dangerous and do nothing, right? Off the back of that, there was then a consultation at the end of last year. We responded to it as Gay Men's Network in about November, because what the NHS was saying was, well, we'll stop the routine prescription of puberty blockers, but we'll allow them in, quote, 1, exceptional cases, and 2, a clinical trial. The significance of this week's announcement is this. NHS England have said, right, no more exceptional cases, which is brilliant, right? Because we were scared, frankly speaking, because of activism and ideology in this area, that people would be, I hesitate to use the word groomed, but I can't think of a better one, Deb. You know what I mean? Trained to present themselves as exceptional cases. That's not going to happen now. And in terms of the study, which frankly gives me nightmares, NHS England have said, look, one, the study, yes or no, will not affect the fact that we are not routinely prescribing them. They're just not an option now on the NHS. But two, they've said, look, in terms of that study, it's got to be ethical. And that's actually a really good sign, because if you're saying something is not safe, right, how do you have an ethical study? So I think while Stonewall and Mermaids have latched onto that as a chink of light, I think that's a false hope for them. That only leaves, so far as we're concerned in England, private provision, which we are looking at. That's in the national news. Liz Truss, our former Prime Minister, tried to get a bill talked about in Parliament today to deal with private providers. Unfortunately, it was filibustered out disgracefully by people not taking this very seriously. So we've got that loose end to deal with, private providers. And the other loose end we've got to deal with, and it's a big loose end, is Scotland, because Scotland follows WPATH. And in fact, they advertised a job just a day ago saying we follow WPATH Standards of Care 8. So, you know, while you were sort of talking at the beginning about the influence of this American organization, don't underestimate that, right? This organization sets what happens in Scotland. But we are a very, very, very long way forward. And that's great news. And it's great news for very, very, very vulnerable children who, up to this point, frankly, were being treated as a live experiment, given what we know about bone growth, given what we know just about common sense in terms of what kids are giving up, you know, and in terms of what we know about cognitive implications. So in a nutshell, that's what's happened this week. It's great news, and it's reverberating around the planet.
What about the legislation? I know there has been in the UK and in Canada, I believe as well, banning so-called conversion therapy.
We're still fighting. Yeah, sorry, Deb.
Well, I was just going to say, for the audience benefit, if you haven't watched our previous shows with Dennis, what we used to think of as conversion therapy, which was pretty barbaric and directed at gay individuals to get them to not be gay anymore, is now, if you think about it, kind of what transitioning people is, because it's even, I believe, in some of the testimony in the WPATH files, individuals who are doing psychotherapy at the Tavistock were told that it was more, it was, you know, wouldn't it be just as mad, so to speak, for the child to end up gay as to end up trans, as if they were okay with that. That was a perfectly legitimate thing to transition a gay boy or a young lesbian to be trans, heterosexual, rather than to have them grow up gay. And that blew my mind. When I heard that in the interview with Andrew Doyle, I just had to pause and stop and digest that.
Yeah, it's shocking.
Still where we are.
It's shocking, Deb. It's like we've recreated gay conversion therapy under the banner of gender. And all that's happened is that homosexuality has been remedicalized, right? It was once in the past, and, you know, with electrodes and all kinds of things. And that is the case now. You're quoting the interview with Dr. Az Hakim, who was a consultant psych at the Tavistock. He's a gay man. And what you're recounting is him talking to a senior practitioner there, saying, look, aren't these kids just all gay? Isn't this a bit mad? And as you've just said, the senior practitioner said, well, is it any more mad than being gay? That's how these guys think, right? And we know, we've got legions of evidence about this. The classic Times report on this said staff at the Tavistock used to joke, soon there will be no gay people left. Staff there said it feels like a new form of gay conversion therapy. It is a shocking, in my view, crime against humanity. But it makes sense when you think about it, because the diagnostic criteria for being a trans kid is exactly the same set of characteristics as you often see in kids who are going to grow up to be gay, right? They do tend to be, there's good evidence on this, do tend to be gender non-conforming. I wasn't a very sporty kid. You know, my brothers were all quite sporty. I wasn't. You know, tomboyish girls, you know, like not all tomboys are going to be lesbians, right? But there's a reason we have the phrase butch type, right? We have that because gender nonconformity in my community is not unusual. It's just, I wouldn't even call it nonconformity. So the Tavistock knew full well that there was a problem with this, but they tried to shut it down. When Dr. David Bell one of the former governors and trustee of the Tavistock, raised this and said in terms, look, I think gay conversion is going on here. They disciplined him. They tried to silence him. They harassed him. They did the same to the safeguarding lead, Mrs. Sonia Appleby, a social worker and someone who deals, safeguarding expert, like 20 years experience. She went through hell and back, all because she said, I'm not happy with mermaids, which is a crazy organization in the United Kingdom that sort of enthusiastically campaigns for child sex changes against all the evidence. They've come out this week and said, we're going to advocate for puberty blockers, even though they've got the NHS say that it is not safe. So that's, we know from Hannah Barnes's book, Time to Think, that the best data we have on this is that 80% of the boys and 90% of the girls are same-sex attracted. So that covers both gay and bisexual, right? That's enormous, right? What are we in the population, realistically? Not these overinflated surveys, but like we can't be more than 5%, if that, I would say, of the population. So to have 80, 90%. And then the autism figures, absolutely off the scale. Autism spectrum in the UK population, I think generally runs at 2%. Tavistock, it runs at 35%. And, you know, how do autistic people read the world? They read it in terms of rigid binary categories. Oh, sure. I don't act like the other boys. I must be a girl. I don't act like the other girls. I must really be a boy. There was no medical curiosity about all of this. And then as you to come to your question, I'm afraid trans activists got behind very, very sinister bills called conversion therapy bans, which sound good, but they're wolf in sheep's clothing, or a Trojan horse, if you like, because we all know what gay conversion therapy is, right? But you have to ask yourself, what is trans conversion, right? Because what the activists say is that trans conversion is sitting down with the child. So when you've got an autistic girl coming in with a breast binder saying, I am a boy, if you say to that girl, actually, I think you're highly autistic, I think you're reading the world in black and white, and that binder is going to hurt you, which they do, right? Despite them being handed out. Sure. No one seems to care about girls and what those things do to them. The conversion therapy bans say, that's trans conversion therapy. So they are really sinister, these things, Deb. They make criminals of doctors who do not accept a child's self-diagnosis. That's mad. Can you imagine doing that in any other field of psychiatry? Like if you had, you know, let's focus on girls because there's an explosion of girls here, right? Because girls, we know, are way more prone to social contagions. We saw that after the book Sybil with multiple personality disorder. We know that from eating disorders.
Satanic panic too.
Quite, you know, and suddenly you get a huge explosion and it's all girls, right? And it tends to cluster as well, like a lot of these social contagions do. And no one expresses any medical curiosity. And they don't because they're scared, because they've been intimidated by ideological charities who know nothing about medicine at all. The mermaids of this world, Stonewall as well, who's supposed to protect gay people. And the doctors know that if they put a foot wrong, they're going to be pilloried. This is grotesque dereliction of duty. And these conversion therapy bans were the kind of cherry on top. Now, I'm very pleased to say any attempt to introduce one in the United Kingdom has been met with defeat. There was a private member's bill that was, which is just like an MP rather than the government bringing a bill forward. And that was pretty much, there was a good discussion about it, but that was pretty much torn apart. There's one going on in Scotland. There's going to be another attempt to bring one in by a Tory backbencher. But so far, I think we're having a really good open argument about these, saying, look, you're trying to chill clinical practice. Like all the bills they're bringing forward in the UK are saying we're going to exempt doctors, we're going to exempt parents, which leads me to the question, well, what are you criminalizing? So, yeah. You know, we are in a better place in terms of that debate, but this legislation is sinister. It's really sinister. And it's about pushing the criminal law into clinical practice to say you've got to conform with our ideology. And who's paying the price? The most vulnerable kids. I think that there possibly are, you know, I can't think of a kid more vulnerable than like an autistic lesbian, yeah. You know, who's being told online that the solution to your happiness, your solution to not fitting in is to go and have an elective amputation. You know, it sounds crazy saying it out loud, but that's what's happening. And not only are they vulnerable, right, at the very point where they need someone to stand up for them, a children's commissioner, a charity, an autism charity. All of those things are captured. All of those things are captured. Now, I think we're reversing the flow, but I consider it a moral catastrophe, and I consider it grotesque. A generation of girls have basically been abandoned to this. And that's not to underplay what's happened to boys. We've all seen Jazz Jennings, seen Richie perhaps online. It's happening to boys too, and that's just as grotesque. But the sex skew at these gender clinics is extraordinary, right? Yeah. It is extraordinary. Girls, at these gender clinics, boys used to outnumber girls. Historically, that was the case. But since this new movement, the girls outnumber the boys, and that tells you something is wrong. Anyway, sorry, that was a very long answer, Deb. But
no, I appreciate that, and I think, you know, what, as I'm listening to you speak, it is even that much more horrifying, impressive, some version of both, that an American-based organization that even I assumed was a medical organization. I thought WPATH had some kind of grounding in like medicine, you know, that there was something, and to find out it's actually not at all. It's kind of like Good Housekeeping. I mean, it's sort of this self-identified organization that just decided we are going to be the setters of the standard of care worldwide. That I think I would love for you to help us understand, like, how does that even happen? How does Marcy Bowers, how does a person like this, who is a man, okay, and I'm going to go ahead and say that, and YouTube can be mad at me all they want, but what stands out to me, especially in view of how many girls are being, you know, treated this way, is that the people most powerful and at the tippy top, not just of WPATH, but even in government, Pritzker, for example, or the barrister who came and spoke to Andrew, who, you know, okay, power to this person for having the guts to go on the show with Andrew Doyle to talk about it, but is a man. That the people, and our own Surgeon General, who is a man, that it is grown men who seem to be at the top of these organizations, pushing them forward, making sure they're not challenged, making sure any challenge is met with some kind of legal action or punishment. And most of the people being hurt are children, because there are adults who are hurt too. Children, and then of those, primarily gay children, you know, pre-gay boys and girls who could be anything, you know, could be just autistic.
Yeah. And that leads one to the use of and the creation of the trans child as a strategic crutch. All right. If you don't have the trans child, right, you have to go out and make the case that Rachel Levine should use female spaces, for example, right? It's quite a difficult case to make. So the trans child has always been strategically, politically important so that people can play doctor and nurses and paint themselves as great heroes, right? But we know it is a lie. It's an invention, right? When you and I were growing up, we didn't have anything, you know, we didn't have the trans child. We didn't, it's very rare. I happen to have met people who've transitioned, but that's because I grew up as a gay man and went to gay bars, and they tended to be the homosexual transsexuals, right? Who often had terrible backgrounds of homophobia and that sort of thing. And so it leads, so the trans child is strategically important in that sense because it provides the moral impetus and the political momentum for this movement, which likes to pretend at child safeguarding. But I'm afraid it's in fact entirely the opposite, right? Because as Dr. Hilary Cass said, a child who turns up at a gender clinic and says, I have got the wrong body, and Dr. David Bell repeated this week, the worst thing you can do is foreclose what is going on by saying, well, you're trans. That's the magic bullet. That's the answer to your problems, because these children have a cluster of comorbidities. They have bullying, they have autism traits, they have serious depression. Oftenly, they have high rates of anxiety. So that's what you're actually dealing. And Cass called it diagnostic overshadowing, to say, look, all your problems are gender. But they need that strategically. That's what they base. Mermaids wouldn't exist, right, if there wasn't a trans child. The ACLU is always going on about protect trans youth and so on. So they need this politically. But as I say, it is a lie. It is a misdiagnosis. It's an unstable diagnosis anyway, because what's the criterion? How do you test for a gender identity? I'd like a doctor to give me an answer to this question. With a highly autistic patient, give me a scientific test that tells me the difference between someone who has a gender identity and someone who just has very high levels of autism. There's no such test, right? Because there's no such thing as a gender identity. So this is speculative. But the structural stuff you're talking about in terms of how this movement functions, I think Professor Kathleen Stock put it best in an article she wrote about this, where she said you've got a really weird alliance in trans, right? Because you've got the classic autogynephiles. So these are generally heterosexual men, such as you've described, who seem to have an insatiable appetite for transitioning children. I think Levine has been on the record saying this is life-saving. We've got to expand this, and is a keen advocate of it. So you've got all those guys, right, where the origin of the identity is paraphilic, right? It as a result of that sort of thing. But then you've got a bureaucratic quarter on the other side. So the leader of, which tends to be female, funnily enough. So like the leader of Mermaids was Susie Green, who famously transitioned her own son on his 16th birthday. He was castrated in Thailand. The leader of Stonewall was Nancy Kelly. The person who changed Stonewall from a gay organization into a trans organization was Ruth Hunt. So you've got these two quite weird wings, right? One's quite governmental, policy wonkish, and that sort of thing, and the other is just full out AGP. And they've inhabited a political space together as unlikely bedfellows, but I'm afraid they've made for a very toxic and very effective combination, because frankly they've snuck up on all of us, right? I think a lot of this happened while all of us thought, certainly I thought, our gay rights is done. I mean, frankly, the minute we got civil partnership, I wasn't too fussed about marriage. Like, I'm glad we got it, but the minute we got civil partnership, I kind of thought, right, job done. Right. And this alliance that I'm describing, my God, it's good at working in the shadows, and WPATH is a very good example of that.
Yeah. And the other thing, as I mentioned, is that most people don't realize it's an American organization having an impact on the rest of the world. I think a lot of people, especially after the mermaid scandal that we covered before, and having heard of Stonewall and the Tavistock, maybe more, they may have believed that this is something that had its origins internationally, or that somehow we were following on the heels of the Tavistock, instead of realizing that WPATH was really the organization that spread this worldwide, and that it has gone down to the level of the practice of medicine, even at the NHS, in terms of computer software, American designed computer software to designate gender and things of that nature. And I can almost guarantee you the average person watching this has no idea.
Yeah.
No idea.
And I don't blame them in a way, because WPATH is very good at concealing the fact, and I think it deliberately conceals the fact that its origins are American. It often describes international best practice. It's always having conferences all over the planet. I think GenSpect had a conference in Ireland at one point, and they deliberately held it where they did because WPATH was just literally down the road in the next hotel, right? So WPATH is very, very politically adept. It knows how to conceal what it's doing, and it's very plausible. You still see this. You see the Scottish government talking about international best practice, and like, who doesn't want to be in favor of that? That's, there's only so much time in the day, right? You and I have got our heads stuck in this debate, so we know it back to front. But if someone came to us and we didn't know about this debate and said it's international, but of course you're going to take that on face value, because you don't expect this level of deviousness from an organization, and I'm afraid it is devious, but it's been highly effective. But I think I'm glad to say, I think those days are coming to an end. Thank the Lord.
It's tragic, though, that our trust in medical care in general has been so shattered between COVID and this. What I think a lot of people are feeling, I know I'm feeling it, is that while I was always a conscientious and curious consumer of medicine, regardless of so-called best practice, because I understand logic and I don't really respond well to appeals to authority. It's just in my nature. So I'm always asking questions, and I want to be informed before I consent to things. But most people, as you said, there's only so many hours in a day. And so they hear the authority of international best practice, whatever, and they go with it. But now because of this and because of some other things, I think I'm worried that now we're going to have it go the other direction where kids who genuinely need care, because we aren't going to eliminate the reasons so many children are confused, anxious, whatever, whether it's coming from social media, spending too much time on there, whether it's microplastics in their diet with it's being force fed to them by free lunch from government, whatever. We see testosterone declining across the board too. So there are some very real things happening to our children and our young adults. And we've now had exposés in Abigail Schreier's latest book about how we can't trust these practitioners, but we don't have anything to replace them. It has so dominated the teaching of medicine, pediatric care, and care for autism and so on and so forth, the American Academy of Pediatrics and so forth, that now parents that come to me and say, well, what do I do? I still have a child with high anxiety who says I'm not really a girl or not really a boy. I still have a child who's confused. I don't trust the therapists. Even if we ban it all tomorrow, where do I go? How do I get my child the help they so desperately need? And this is going to be a bigger hurdle. I mean, I realize it's not something you can speak to, but I just want to point out to people that we have a long way to go. I mean, first we've got to change how people see things in America, because Scotland hasn't even fallen. Talk to us about Scotland. Why Scotland? This shocks me so much that Scotland is just holding on to this thing and has always been more fiercely defensive of this trans stuff than any other place in the United Kingdom and the British Isles.
Yeah. Scotland has fallen victim to the curse of what happens with countries. You see this in Ireland and Australia as well. When a country is governed by a disconnected elite, right? And they all go to the same dinner parties and they all went to the same university and they're quite distant from the people, they end up entertaining elite sort of preoccupations that often have nothing to do with the public and the public don't like very much. The Irish government got a rude awakening on this, thank goodness, a couple of weeks ago, tried to remove the word mother from the Constitution.
Oh, that was great.
Oh, it was fantastic. That's a classic example of a disconnected elite, though, right? If you sat around the very privileged ruling class dinner party circuit of Dublin, everyone would have told you they were going to win that referendum. But my God, they got a kick. And you keep seeing this, right? This happened with the voice referendum in Australia. I think it happened a little bit with the Trump upset, actually, because no one expected Trump to win the first time round. It was just sort of taken as read that wouldn't be the case. I think you also saw it in Brexit. Now, the trouble with the Scottish government, I'm afraid, is it just doesn't learn, because Scotland has a federal kind of a federal system, or a devolved system, we would call it. But I think it's fair to say that the governing class in Scotland are not terribly good at governing. Like, 5 or 6 of their statutes have been struck down. Our government in the United Kingdom famously stopped them introducing self-ID. So a guy says he's a woman and then he can go into the ladies, right? But they just keep bashing their head against the wall. And that's partly because gender has become a sort of civic religion and a preoccupation for the ruling classes. And one of the ways you can signal you are progressive is by embracing gender. It is also, and this is important, it's also a really good substitute for governing. So if you're not very good, like Scotland's got the second highest drugs deaths in Europe at the moment. It's got a terrible problem with heroin. And I think it's something like 10 times in front of the next one down. But if you're not very good at solving that kind of thing, what you can do is get on telly and talk about gender or conversion therapy bans or self-ID. And there's also a suggestion that's what the Irish government were doing with this referendum that they didn't really need in any event. So it's sort of like a distraction, a substitution model. And it's also a point of pride now, because the government in Scotland is Scottish National Party, and they kind of make a point of always doing what England is not doing. But I think they're going to have a rude awakening on this, because the conversion therapy bill they've introduced is hilarious. Like, it's so wide. And a very senior Scottish King's Counsel, so one of our really senior attorneys, wrote an opinion this week, a couple of weeks back, Aidan O'Neill case, and he said, look, your bill is going to suppress, sorry, it's going to criminalize anyone if they suppress an expression of sexuality, right? Doesn't matter what the sexuality is. And he argued very convincingly legally, saying, right, if I tell my teenage son he cannot have pictures of topless women on a poster in his bedroom, I'm suppressing his heterosexuality and I'm guilty under your act. It's, you know, that's how crazy this stuff is. It's
You
so,
don't make the other guy go, oh no, we don't care about him.
yeah.
We only care about your, you know, your adult son who's still living at home and putting naked pictures of children on the wall.
Quite.
You know, you can't suppress that.
Yeah.
I
So
mean,
it's just amateur hour stuff, Deb. It
yeah.
really is. You know, these guys don't know how to govern. And, you know, all the states that have ridden headlong into this are getting a real headache now. So, for example, the Australian state of Victoria, down in the south, introduced one of these conversion therapy bans, right? I don't think they knew this was going to happen, but their human rights regulator, as was recently quoted in the House of Lords debate about this sort of thing, that's issued instructions for public prayer in churches. And it has told churches, I'm not kidding you, it has told churches, you cannot say to congregants, basically, we are all sinners, and you know that stuff about, you know, repenting your sins and asking for forgiveness, because that's suppressing an element of identity. I mean, I don't know, but it's just the most grotesque state overreach. And I'm afraid this is the prospectus of gender ideologues. Yeah. They don't respect democracy. They don't respect civil rights. They don't respect the difference between church and state. They don't respect the difference between state and parent, right? There's something really dark at the heart of all this, because this is really quite alien to Western norms, all of this stuff. I mean, you know, a human rights regulator telling you what you can say in church.
It is kind of ridiculous. But you know, now I'm going to ask for your opinion. So, you know, this is just an opinion question. You just mentioned some things about Scotland and how, you know, to some degree, they want to do whatever England's not doing. To some degree, it's kind of a civic religion and things like that. And then we just said about Australia. But on the flip side, you have evidence that came out with the WPATH files that Redux representative spoke about, Genevieve Gluck, I believe is her name. And she said that they found information that connected WPATH, at least loosely, I think, or they published something that connected to a fetish group or fetish site that was these anonymous fetishists were giving them feedback to set certain standards as far as the, you know, gender identities of very young boys. And, you know, I mean, things that would give you nightmares. So there's the side, you know, there's a side of me wondering, you know, how much of this is there are people who fundamentally are twisted and have a kind of new cult-like religious fervor around something that most Westerners just can't even comprehend because it's so twisted and outside the norms, like you just described. And how much of it is more of, as you point out, sort of an entry for tyranny in general. Like, we're going to pick kids, vulnerable kids we can medicalize, make a bunch of money. Then we can channel that money into our political goals, which is basically, you know, oh, we can achieve our SDG climate, you know, reduction of population goals by sterilizing X percentage of people. Like, how much of it is just a way for bad governing, you know, entities to seize more power, you know, in ways that we're like afraid to challenge. So there's like this super cynical side and this like really conspiratorial side. And I mean, it might be a blend of both, but what's your take? I mean, both are real, right? Both are real.
My take, certainly from like the gay rights point of view, is this. I feel like we've been here before, because in the 1970s, there was an organization in the United Kingdom called the Paedophile Information Exchange, PI for short, right? And it tried to infiltrate gay rights. And it was hugely successful, right? It was successful to the point that people who went on to become Labour frontbenchers, who at the time were working for Liberty, which is a bit like the ACLU, that kind of organization, they you know, really quite senior figures. I think Harriet Harman, who's quite a senior figure in the United Kingdom, a lawyer by trade in terms of the Labour Party, she wrote an opinion for them, a public opinion, so that in defending their goals, and I believe that was about the decriminalization of images or something similar to that, one of their key goals. So I'm afraid to say that one of the things we have to deal with both as gay men and lesbians is that we kind of got this dark water at the edge of gay rights, and there's always sharks in it. And anytime we are weak, they flood right in and start taking over our organizations. And I think we've been systemically weakened, particularly by the AIDS epidemic, and taking out a whole layer of leadership, and depriving us of, handing down knowledge and just structurally weakening us. So these people have always wanted political advancement and political recognition, and therefore it doesn't surprise me at all that Genevieve Gluck found what she did when she found what you're describing, which is a site called the Eunuch Archives, which is insane stuff. Now, the Eunuch Archives were mentioned, I think, in a draft of the WPATH standards of care. Must have been 7, I guess, because the latest one is 8. And Genevieve, I don't know how she did this. I remember watching her first show about this with Graham Linehan. She went into the belly of the beast, and she found a collection of, I guess it's got to be men, hasn't it? It's got to be 100% men online. And maybe they were fantasizing, maybe they weren't, but they had a very, very keen interest in, I would call it torture, but castrating boys, and there being a sexual element to all of this. And then lo and behold, surprise, surprise, WPATH Standards of Care 8 suddenly tells us that if I don't know, 13, no, actually it doesn't have any age limits. So let's say a 12-year-old boy comes to you and says, I want to be a eunuch, then you're not allowed to be freaked out by that. That's a gender identity, and we've got to castrate him. I mean, this is mad, right? If that 12-year-old boy walks in and says that to you as a doctor, the first thing you do is you pick up the damn phone and you ring the police and you say, who's been putting ideas into this boy's head? And then you say, whoever's come in with him, you need to be arrested, mate. This is grotesque. And the idea that they felt confident enough to put that out in public really scares me. All right, because all, the boiling frog stuff, all of this stuff tests the waters. All of this stuff pushes the boundaries. And by the time they are saying in public, we think this is acceptable, what the hell are they going to come up with next? I think I know, because Andrea Long Chu did an article in the New York magazine, and the cat's out of the bag. In that he said, it doesn't matter if it's even a 5-year-old, right, or no age limits. Doesn't matter if they're schizophrenic. Everyone should have whatever surgery they want. And this kind of loops back to what you were saying about confidence in doctors. This isn't medicine anymore, right? Because this isn't diagnosis and treatment. This is surgery on demand following a consumer model in a state of complete anarchy. And anarchy is really dangerous, because anarchy just means the law of the jungle. And all that happens with the law of the jungle is the absolute strongest survive. And the strongest would include, I'm afraid, the sort of men who are contributing to those fetish forums. And we know that this can happen in real life, because we had a case, this involved adults rather than children, but we had a case sentenced in the Old Bailey just about a month ago. The Recorder of London sentenced 3 men to terms of imprisonment for running a castration outfit in North London. Then they were doing this and they were filming it. You got to remember, there's a market for this stuff. People consume this stuff on the internet. So there's some very, very dark stuff here that WPATH are trying, or have tried, to normalize. But I would expect that from them, because, as you know from the files, Deb, these are the kind of people that say, well, cross-sex hormones might have caused a liver tumor, but on we go. Or this guy's schizophrenic, but let's perform an amputation. They don't care, because this isn't medicine. This isn't medicine anymore. This is a religion. It's getting very close to flesh sacrifices. It's getting very close to ritualized mistreatment of very vulnerable people. And I don't know how Genevieve does it, to be honest. I have to say, it's dark as hell. It really is.
I told you, even just watching Andrew Doyle's program, I had to stop multiple times.
Yeah.
And collect myself.
Right.
One other thing that came out of the WPATH that was so shocking to me is how many kids can present with things having nothing to do with gender. So in other words, they could go in and say, I don't like my body, I have anorexia. And the suggestion will be made to them that they have gender dysphoria. that they're gender confused, that the reason they don't like their body is they're actually the other gender. So you have children whose no other complaint or no other symptom was depression and anorexia suddenly being treated within minutes in some cases, not days, not hours or anything like that, minutes, being injected with testosterone. And I just had to close the computer and I was like, I needed to go take a walk. I couldn't even wrap my brain around it. And then, like I said, I like so many people, the cognitive dissonance is so powerful that, you know, how would doctors do this? How would people claiming that to do no harm do this? It's got to be for the money. Like, it was easier for me to think it's for the money than they genuinely believe this is fine. Like you said, ritualistic sacrifice, flesh sacrifice, because the more I look at this, the more I lean that way. The less I think it's about money.
Yeah, I think there are some people who are very deep into this ideology, and they believe that we all have these immutable gender souls, and they believe God gets it wrong sometimes and puts us in the wrong body. And I think that's crazy myself. I think it's absolutely crazy. But I'm forced to think that some people believe this as fervently as they believe in a God. Although I am given some pause in that, because just like the case you've referenced, Maria Hughes, the author of the WPATH files, she came across an example where a girl secured testosterone, I think after 9 minutes, Deb?
Something crazy. It was 9 minutes.
Mm-hmm. And if you're giving a drug that serious, you know, let's not forget what testosterone does, right? You put that into a female body, right? The chances of heart attacks significantly go. The chance, testosterone is a carcinogen, for goodness sake, right? Men can metabolize it in a way that women can't. It leads. I've heard people who work in this area say, well, they've never dealt with a trans man who isn't incontinent. They don't tell you that, do they? Because testosterone, you need estrogen in the vaginal walls, otherwise they start to atrophy. They're not telling these kids this kind of stuff, you know. It is extraordinary that we are in this situation, but I think we're dealing with adherents of a new civic religion, and I think they see it as their divine mission. It almost becomes sacramental, this stuff. It's no longer, and rich, as I say, that I use ritual in its non-religious sense there. It's almost like, you know, you come in and this is the sacrament that we perform on you, and that'll fix everything. And it's so obviously wicked, because what little confused child, you know, who is depressed or lonely doesn't want to be told, here's the magic bullet, here's the solution to all your problems, here's the thing that'll fix you, here's the injection. Oh, and in addition to that, here's a whole new support group, and you're special, and you're popular, and you're not, you know, you're not just a kid who's going through what all kids do, you know, who's awkward or lonely. You're special. You've got a special thing called a gender identity. This is wicked behavior.
It really is.
Behavior.
Now, before the show began, you told me that there are implications in the United States because of, and maybe elsewhere, I don't know, but because of the ACLU.
Yeah.
That the revelation of these files is causing some ripples. So can you explain that to us?
Sure. The WPATH files have got two potential legal effects in the States, which are big. In the first place, anyone who's got a malpractice lawsuit now has a new evidence bundle that they can point to, right? And several of the clinicians named in the WPATH files are pretty senior figures, right? There's very good chance that these are going to be people who have quite a lot of patients. There's a lot of surgeons and stuff in there. And you've got explosive stuff in there with doctors sounding a little bit like they're just making it up as they're going along. In fact, I'm understating that. That is how they sound. And they are swapping tits. I mean, that case I talked to you about a moment ago, you know, with the cancerous tumors on the girl's liver. You know, this is someone in their 20s, 30s, Deb, who ended up in palliative care, which was a sentence I thought I'd never read. I don't know how these people sleep at night. But in any event, that's the first thing. The malpractice suits, this is big. But perhaps the more significant thing is these ACLU lawsuits, right? So you've got all these states like Kentucky passing these bans. The ACLU are challenging them. And what's happening when it's getting up to the circuit courts is that the judges are being asked to say, you know, is this medically justified? Does any state in the union have a legitimate public interest in regulating this in the same way they might regulate, say, like a Jehovah's Witness refusing a blood transfusion, that kind of thing, right? It's that barrier between state and individual. And
Right.
what's happening is the judges have got two bundles in front of them. One bundle from the ACLU tends to be, and has been historically, all WPATH stuff. The ACLU have been relying on WPATH a lot. And then they've got another bundle from the Karadanskis of this world that surveys everything that's going on in Europe and all of the actual evidence. So this stuff is pretty seismic because at the moment you've got quite a few cases in your appellate circuits. Certainly the Kentucky one is interesting. That could, but where we're getting a disagreement with different appellate circuits. So some are going with the states, some are going with the ACLU. As you know, that's a recipe for a Supreme Court case. And one just hopes to God that the Supreme Court puts something on the docket soon, because I just think, whatever you think of the Supreme Court, whether you're conservative or whether you're liberal, my view is if this gets to the Supreme Court, I think it could be quite positive, because I think the Supreme Court could have some pretty choice words to say about what's going on with WPATH. It might not be the solution we all want, because you might well get a sort of reversal of Roe v. Wade type judgment from the Supreme Court, which is, I think, what you're going to get, where they're going to say it's a matter for the states, but the states can do this. But that might have huge implications, just the hearing of that case, wouldn't it, for the whole of the United States? And by God, I hope it happens, because people need to hear about this stuff. We need to be talking about it.
It's an unpopular view, I know, that I'm about to express, but I didn't particularly like that decision for that exact reason. I don't think people's individual liberties should be put to democratic vote. I think if you're either going to protect rights or you're not. Sending it back to the states is saying it's okay for an individual state to decide that people don't have individual liberty. So it felt a little like, and when I look at this issue, I look at the rights of the child, even the rights of a vulnerable adult, and I think about why we have consent laws in the first place. We have consent laws in the first place to protect people from bad actors, and to make sure that informed consent is, to protect people from fraud and so forth and so on. If for nothing else, for expediency, so the courts are not filled up with people full of regrets and suing people for fraud. But when it comes to children, I mean, we have these laws on the books already. Like, my daughter can't get her ears pierced without my permission, but she could go in most states and have all kinds of terrible surgeries to maim her for life. And so I really genuinely hope they don't do that. They don't kick it back to the states, because I think we have to take a stand as civilized human beings to say that informed consent is a thing, and you cannot protect individual liberty per the Bill of Rights, whatever you want to call it. You cannot possibly do that effectively by leaving it up to popular vote as to what constitutes informed and what constitutes consent. That at a certain point we have to, I don't know. This is, I'm sure I'm going to get heat all over. I thought you were a civil libertarian. And I'm like, I am, but I don't, that's why I don't want states deciding that in this state you have the rights, but in that state you don't, because popularity.
I guess though, that kind of backtracking a little bit on what I said, though, I guess the WPATH files actually have the capacity to change the dynamic of what goes on in court, precisely because of the points you've just made, actually. Because the case as it was in the appellate circuit, it's going to be very different to by the time you get to the Supreme Court. Because if you're like, I don't know, the Attorney General of Tennessee or Kentucky or something, you can now say these kids did not consent in law. So how can any state permit that, right? So it may be you're correct. It may be that the Supreme Court says actually the evidence on this has changed so dramatically now,
right?
And this really blows it wide open,
right? That's my hope. That's my hope, actually, because I think unlike the abortion case, which is much muddier, because we cannot establish an exact point, that we all agree on about when life begins and all these, myriad conversations to firmly establish when the conflicting rights, separate and aren't in conflict anymore. But this, I think we can. I think this has a much clearer delineation between consent and non-consent in law. And I'm no lawyer, but that's how I look at it. And when I'm listening to the people speaking, even in the WPATH people speaking in their own voices, the things they're admitting to, they're making clear that they know that the consent is not informed by either the parent or the child.
Yeah, well, there's that quote, isn't there? Talking to a 14-year-old is like talking to a blank slate, one of the doctors said. And, you know, they're not in the developmental space for this. But you don't think that makes me angry, Deb, is like, I'm glad they admitted it, but we damn well know this, right?
Yeah, this is not news.
If I talk to a 13-year-old girl and say, do you want babies? She's going to say, oh, no teenage girl wants to get pregnant, right?
That's right.
We know this. We know that they're not in the developmental space for this. I don't need WPATH doctors to tell me a prepubertal boy doesn't understand like what giving up orgasmic function would be, or a prepubertal girl doesn't understand the same, or fertility implications. We damn well know that, because there is a difference between children and adults.
That's right.
The
other argument they make that I do not find compelling at all is the one about how most adults don't fully understand the functionality of their own bodies enough to consent to their various treatments and surgeries. And they give the example of the diabetic who doesn't understand how the pancreas works. I'm like, but to the point made by the journalist or the doctor, actually, I think it was from GenSpect. Yes, but we do know there's an objective test of when someone is a diabetic. Like we can say this person is a diabetic, this person is not a diabetic. And we tell you definitively, this test is absolutely an objective measurement that you are. And this is the treatment. And by the way, there's just decades and decades of evidence to show that insulin is the appropriate treatment. It's you don't need to be a medical professional understanding the functions of your entire endocrine system to figure it out. But when we talk about gender, we have no way to measure that you are, in fact, this other gender. And then on top of that, we have no long-range studies, because it wouldn't be ethical, to figure out if this is the appropriate treatment. That is not analogous at all.
Of course not. It's such a bogus argument, right? Because it's not comparing like for like. What we are comparing is results, right? That's
right.
If I'm a diabetic, I know the result of insulin. That's all I need to understand. Right. But if I am a 13-year-old girl, I don't understand the result of losing my fertility. I don't know what that's going to look like to me as a grown woman who perhaps is mourning, or I don't know what it's going to look like if I have a double mastectomy and I miss the opportunity and I mourn the opportunity to breastfeed my children. There's no way I know what that is, age 13. So it's just a dumb argument. They keep doing this. They're not very good at it. It's like on the puberty blockers thing over here. They're saying, oh, well, we use them on cis. I hate that word. We use puberty blockers on cis children. It's like, yeah, we do for a short time for like 7-8-year-old girls who are menstruating, right? And then we take them off the puberty blocker.
And even then, it's still not recommended because of the damage to the bones. Even for the short period of time, you're talking about extraordinarily powerful drugs.
Right.
I mean, these are the kinds of drugs in the same class of drugs they used to castrate Alan Turing.
Yeah.
I mean, they've used these as punishment. And I can't conceive of it. And certainly the 8-year-old can't decide. Anyway, but legally speaking, can you help me understand also the implications, not just of the files, but of just gender medicine in general, and the things that it's done to everything from, getting a driver's license to being credentialed to do certain jobs to I mean, we've gotten to a point now where gender identity is a protected class, at least in the United States. I don't know how it is in the United Kingdom. Not yet. Okay. So here it is. And for example, through some of the title legislation in education, you've got school districts around our country who are finding they are risking their funding if they don't let boys in the girls' bathroom, if they don't, let them in the sports, if they don't do all these things, because they're treating it as like a protected class of people, even though the very doctors who are doing these procedures cannot answer a straight question of how do you firmly establish that a person has a non-normative gender identity, that a gender identity even exists, that it's even a thing. And yet it's now a protected class. And so legally, what I'm asking is, how do people, let's say athletes or practitioners, doctors who don't want to comply with these things or whatever, legally, how do you fight something like that when you've got...
It's tough, I'm afraid, because once it's in the law, right, And once you've got funding contingent on it, you're somewhat at the mercy of it. And the only answer is to go back to the root of the problem and get it the hell out of law, because it should have no place in law, right? This is a self-reported phenomenon that is unfalsifiable. This is one of the problems with conversion therapy bans, right? If you're going to prosecute someone for suppressing, let's say, a non-binary gender identity, because that's one of these gender identities, right?
Sure.
How could I, as defense counsel, prove someone was lying if they were lying? I can't, right? It's a self-reported phenomenon. You cannot enshrine in your laws, and certainly as protected characteristics, these sorts of self-reported phenomenons that you cannot reference or evaluate or measure against some third-party standard. It is also weird, frankly, in terms of an emancipation or civil rights angle, to have oppression that you can kind of opt into.
I know, right?
It's bogus. It's totally bogus.
I want to go in the girls' bathroom for 75 reasons that have nothing to do with being trans, but I'll say that I'm trans and I have instant entry. We're seeing it in our prisons.
Yeah. I saw a thing about this today, and I saw it. I guess it would have been a Democrat, but someone in one of the state houses was like brought forward a bill saying we must move this massive great bloke who now says he's a woman. He must go into the women's. It's like, yeah, I bet I can guess exactly why he wants to go there, right? I bet.
Well, and we have evidence, to your point about evidence, we have evidence that when they do these things, women get abused. They get raped, they get pregnant, they get, that they absolutely do offend. Yeah. And they still don't pull them out. And so I feel like the United States, to a greater degree apparently than England, has gone mad, has gone crazy.
If someone had told you 20 years ago, Deb, they're going to put massive great male rapists in the women's prisons, you wouldn't have believed that, right?
And I would have believed that women would have stopped them. And instead, what I'm seeing, to your point, is at the administrative level, it's women female politicians on one side of the aisle who are pushing for this. And the people putting the money up and signing the bills are the men. So it's like, it's so twisted. It's so, I can't.
It drives me mad about this movement. And again, to take a name in vain again, Professor Kath Stock made the point really powerfully once and very passionately. She said, the thing that really gets me about Judith Butler, right, is while she sat in Berkeley in her ivory tower, her black tie dinners or whatever, she's never going to be sharing a cell with one of these great big bloody rapists. Yeah, she's never going to be the little lonely autistic vulnerable kid, maybe with homophobic parents, down the gender clinic. She's not going to be the girl who used to get up at, I don't know, 5 a.m. to practice swimming, who suddenly has a medal or a place taken away from her, right? These scions of gender at the top of the tree, they're not the one paying the price. The people paying the price, law of the jungle again here, right? In all this anarchy are the weakest, the most vulnerable, the most excluded, right? You go to a women's prison, it's not pleasant. I've done it professionally, right? The women in there, generally speaking, yes, they've committed crimes, yes, they've been banged up, but their backgrounds you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. These are not women generally from stable or happy backgrounds. So the idea that this, again, it's back to our point, I guess, about governments. We have a disconnected elite here, and this elite has spent so long talking to itself that it's gone mad. Because in their world, in order to be okay with the Judith Butler school of life, right, you have to be a naive utopian. You have to believe that there's there are no rapists who would ever take advantage of self-ID. There are no children who would ever regret having their breasts cut off age 14 or something. There are no boys who have homophobic parents. You have to be utopian. And you know what? I don't mind utopians if they sit around debating chambers in universities, right? But I do mind them being inflicted on vulnerable people and on just civic governance. This is the problem with the trans movement, right? It's full of naive utopians and naive dystopians. The utopians run around saying, no rapist will ever take advantage of this. And the dystopians tell us there's a genocide going on. And that tells you they vacillate through these sort of heights of emotion. Mm-hmm. And that's what they're like. Either everything is smile and happy under the rainbow, or everything's awful and there's a genocide. But common to both things is unreality. These are people of unreality. They don't live in the real world, and they shouldn't have a say over the real world. It is insane that they do.
Right. I mean, that is becoming clear. And just briefly, before we wrap up, from the
Yeah.
WPATH files, I am going to put the resources below for people to go check it out. Was there anything, because I know you've been up to your eyeballs in this from the beginning too, but was there anything that truly shocked you? I mean, where it was even beyond what you thought, it really, really surprised you, and on either direction, either in their favor or against them? Was there anything like that?
Yeah, I had kind of the experience you did with Andy Doyle's show, Deb. I had to stop reading after I read the bit I said to you about that woman, 20, 30 years old, trans identifying, referred to palliative care, and the thing that really, and died as a result of taking, in at least in part it seems, taking testosterone and having a cancer that on her liver that she otherwise would not have had. So what a great civil rights movement you've got here, guys. It's got its own body count, right? And the thing that I found really sad about that was that they just discussed it casually. And there was no mention of, oh, there's a lawsuit from her family or anything like that. It just seems that she was one of the forgotten victims of all of this. And that shocked me. I knew this stuff was bad. I hadn't realized that it was that bad. That was the standout thing for me. And I guess it must have been for you too.
Well, it's what Helen Joyce brought up. And if you watch the Andrew Doyle show, which I do recommend that you do, it's a great, I mean, it's so well done, first of all, but then it's a great sort of digest of the high points and or rather low points of this whole thing. So you'll know what's going on. But she referred to it as the banality of evil, just the casualness with which they were discussing these horrible circumstances that vulnerable people whom they had treated were in. It was kind of like, well, almost like you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. It was so casual, no sense of concern. And that is something also, Dennis, that I want to ask you about is the law around the detransitioner side. I know there are things, the wheels are sort of turning in the United States. I'm wondering how it's happening in on your side of the planet in terms of people who are trying to get it across to normies like me that if they try to seek care to detransition, not only will not be covered by insurance because the World Health Organization is setting these codes and the World Health Organization is even deferring to WPATH, but they'll be counted as gender transitioners. So in other words, they're still going to count it, not as regret, not as a mistake, not as a problem with gender medicine, but it's just another successful transition.
It's just insane, isn't it? It almost makes you think they're rigging it, doesn't it? I think things are going to start moving on this front, right? Particularly now, sadly, that we are some way along to a whole generation being very seriously damaged by this. And once you've got the UK government saying puberty blockers or NHS England anyway saying puberty blockers are not safe, and actually the government repeated that, Secretary of State for Equalities did. That's kind of big, right? That's going to be really big. I would expect rapid developments here, both in respect of that announcement and stuff that's coming out of WPATH. I know there's a class action in our High Court, which these can take a while sometimes because you've got to get a load of experts together. That's coming on stream soon. Richie Heron, I know, has a case going at the moment. He was an adult transitioner. That's going to be really interesting in terms of vulnerable people. And our former Lord Chief Justice did say in the appeal of Bell and Tavistock, so that's the detransitioner Akira Bell taking the Tavistock gender service to court. He said, sitting in the Court of Appeal, and I thought it was really interesting. He said, we're not going to uphold this judicial review. But then he did 2 paragraphs at the end of his judgment saying, look, but don't expect this court to shield you from medical negligence. I think he could see it coming. And I think it is coming, Deb. And I think the damages are going to be enormous. And if they're enormous in this country, in your country, they're going to be like triple, quadruple that. I think the worst thing about all this, I'm afraid to say, is I think sometimes it takes a market to kill a market. And I think the markets are going to defeat gender more than politics will. I think the detransitioners will end up taking chunks out of this industry. I also think what's going to happen, and I think it will happen in the UK as a result of the puberty blockers announcement, is ensuring your practice as a doctor is going to get damn expensive soon. Really expensive. We've already had actuaries in Australia, funnily enough, say we're not going to insure your surgeries anymore. That was the first country where that happened. And Australia's pretty far down the gender road, but I always trust actuaries. These guys are some of the best paid men and women on the planet, and they are because they're good at the odds. And if they're stopping coverage in Australia, they've seen something in the tea leaves. Right. That will happen here as well. If all these private clinics that I'm worried about, I would expect their insurance premiums to go through the roof pretty soon. Now, the NHS are not prescribing, because you think about it, anyone wants to sue you, they just have to go to court and say, look, the NHS were right and he was wrong. That's pretty
true.
Powerful. That's pretty powerful.
That is true. And then I guess finally, the last thing I would ask is for a quick, as well as you can do, from an evidence standpoint, if we were to take the WPATH findings or what they reveal to parents who hear things like, no, we have to teach gender, gender in your kid's classroom, and gender is real, and kids, can choose, and all these things. What are sort of the key points for the parents watching the show they could walk away from to hold on to and say, this or that is not only not true in my opinion, but it's now been demonstrated to not be true?
Yeah, I think that you can say, one, look what happens when you accept that, right? If you follow this to its logical conclusion, some children are going to end up with elective amputations, right? They're going to end up with mastectomies. They're going to end up castrated. And, these guys like to euphemize all this and talk about top and bottom surgery, but that's what's going to happen if you follow it to its logical conclusion. Two, any kid that is slightly more susceptible to this, particularly if they are a girl, right, will disproportionately potentially be dragged into something that they could regret for the rest of their lives. Three, I think parents need to understand they have undersold just how dangerous this stuff is. Testosterone is not a joke. It will increase chances of heart attack. There will be trans men now who will die of heart attacks as a result of this. Estrogen in a male body is not good news, right? Your chance of and as everyone who knows about estrogen knows, your chances of a stroke go up, at least 5%, I think it is, in the first 5 years. And then they go up and up and up and up and up. So what is being sold here under this happy rainbow banner of gender, this is not gay rights 2.0. What's being sold here is a form of transhumanism. They are teaching your children that their bodies are not perfect, but they are consumer goods. And they should be treated like they could be thrown away. But bad news, right? Can't throw your body away. You're stuck with it. So I hope that doesn't sound too patronizing, Deb, but that's
no, I think that's very helpful. It's a good place to end it, I think, because I just want them to understand the seriousness of this. And I don't think anybody is harmed. Don't let them scare you. You are never harmed by waiting for your child to grow up. Absolutely. Love them, nurture them.
Yeah, can I say one more thing, which I think might be useful in terms of my perspective, which is this: please say to parents, please don't be afraid of being called homophobic about any of this, right? Don't let people accuse you of being prejudiced about this, because it's not prejudice to give a damn about your children. And please take comfort from the fact that, well, here's me, a gay man, saying these are the problems with it. Look at Fred Sargent, look at Kate Harris in the UK, or Bev Jackson, and so on. You're not homophobic to be concerned about this. You should be concerned about this.
I would take it a step farther and say that you may actually be protecting gay rights by opposing this, because the high likelihood is that a child with the real gender nonconformity situation is or will grow up to be gay. And we were at a place in the 21st century where that was fine. And then now suddenly it's not. So let's take a couple steps back to sanity, can we?
Please God.
Yes,
Please
right.
God.
Exactly. Dennis, as always, I am so grateful for your time and your wisdom on all of these subjects. To everybody who watched, thank you for listening. Please like and share this broadcast so other people can learn more about what this is all about. And as I said, I will put the resources below for you to click on and look through at your leisure. I just give you fair warning that you need to have a tough hide and a strong stomach to deal with some of it. So thank you, everyone, very, very much for watching. Have a great one.
Thank you.